Welcome to the new For Purpose CEO podcast.
I'm Michelle.
I am Danielle, and we are here to talk about being a CEO in the for-purpose sector. Each episode, we will talk about issues not-for-profit and for-purpose CEOs need to manage based on our 30-plus years of experience. It will be an honest discussion of the highs and the lows, helping you tackle the unique challenges of running a NFP.
Leading can be challenging and sometimes lonely. We get it. Join us and our guests weekly for an honest discussion about running a for-purpose organisation. We will be sharing practical tips, shared experiences and real-world stories to help you tackle the unique challenges of running a for-purpose organisation. Today we're going to talk about the pros and cons of having your senior leadership team in the board meeting with you. I think this is a really interesting one because I don't actually think there's like a right or wrong answer. I think there's just considerations to think about when you decide who is going to come into the board meeting, or rather, I guess we should say, when you have a discussion with the board as to who they want in the room with you. What would your default be? I guess as a CEO, what would your default be?
My preference has always been, obviously, and I'll speak from the position of being a senior leader before being the CEO and then being the CEO. My preference is to have the senior leadership team in the board meeting. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're in the whole board meeting. It might mean that there are different times that they're in the board meeting and therefore some discipline in your agenda is critical.
Would you bring someone in just to talk to like their report and then like send them out so they're kind of coming in to report, or would you think it's better that they listen to more agenda items than just their report?
My preference is they would come in to listen to more agenda items than just the report, but they are certainly there to present either on specific agenda items themselves where they may have presented the briefing and answer the more granular questions that a director may ask. But similarly, I would like them to sit and listen to the broader discussions that the board has. I think there's lots of pros to that. It's actually really helpful for the executive to, through observation, through that sort of experience, to develop an understanding about what considerations directors are making, the kinds of conversations they're having, the kinds of questions that they are likely to ask. It actually helps the executive or the senior leader, I think, draft better reports and briefing papers because they can understand the board's perspective better.
Yeah. And what they want, how they react to the paper.
And then that saves the board time too, right? So that becomes it means that the board meeting's more efficient as well.
So I guess then one of that considerations is if you as the CEO are not the one who has drafted the paper, and obviously you would have read it, you would have checked it and everything, and then if you're not the one who's drafted the paper, it might be better for the exec to hear how the board thinks about that paper, whether it's delivered what they were looking for, and answer questions. And I guess, if you're that exec, you probably feel a bit more included and like your work is being more recognised as well. If, you're actually in there being acknowledged as the author of the report and, you're the one that did the work.
And there's a morale benefit too, because it's also saying that you're more accountable to it. You have greater ownership to it. There's inclusion as part of the discussion and the consideration, because obviously anyone who's writing a paper to the board is that you're putting something to the board to do something with. You're asking the board to take an action on something. And so I think not just when you're the author, but when you're the author who is also presenting and you're also answering questions or being part of the discussion, you have real responsibility and accountability over what you're putting forward.
Yeah. But the CEO is accountable. It's a balance, right? So if you're the CEO, it's your neck, right? Like, so if you present...
Absolutely. It always is, yes.
Yeah. And so I think that's that interesting thing where you are responsible for your team delivering. So you have to ensure that that paper delivers. But yeah, so I think it's an interesting one.
That could be a con as well. So if we broke that up into a pro and con kind of summary, that could also be a con for the CEO. So you need to make sure, if you are the CEO who's bringing your senior leadership team into the board meeting, that your senior leader is ready for that kind of conversation. You don't want to drop them in unprepared or very green without some sort of time or coaching with your senior leadership as to what to expect, how to frame it, what kinds of questions.
Yeah, and I was going to say that's exactly like what kind of warning, what sort of questions, because if the board's then going to say, okay, so what sort of time investment, resources investment, what do we need? You want to make sure that, I guess, the CEO and the exec are aligned in their thinking. And I mean, look, this is just sort of basic prep work, but I guess if you're a new CEO, there's a bit of thinking around bringing in extra people into the board, because you're also, I guess, having to manage your team in the boardroom without it sounding too controlling, but how they respond does reflect on you. And so I think you need to do some of that prep work to make sure. And look, if you've got a good team, then obviously this is easy, right? Like everything in life, right? Like if you've got a good team, it is good. But it also assists you as the CEO, I guess, in having the exec or the author of a particular paper or the head of the business in there, because that discussion that the board then has, you don't now need to go and translate it, and that's all there, done. That's really beneficial, I think, too.
I find as well it's really good for senior leaders to see governance in practice, like at a corporate level, not necessarily just at the operational level. I've been an ops manager before I was a CEO. You're busy, you're not worrying about corporate governance. You're doing your job, someone else deals with that. And sometimes you can feel like the governance aspect is just adding more to your time or your work, and it can feel a bit frustrating. But I think when you can be part of and observe a board meeting and understand the issues and the concerns and matters that boards are considering and they're discussing, you can appreciate that, how that then comes back to you. You can also anticipate, I think, as a senior leader with that level of knowledge, you get to start to anticipate, and you start to bring that governance culture back in through the business as well. And then you create that across, your own teams in terms of those systems and processes and disciplines that hopefully, the goals, outcome of governance, it makes the organization stronger.
Yeah. You just made me think about one of the issues in reporting that I always see is if a board isn't happy with reporting, often it's because they're not sure why they're looking at a paper, or it might be there's too much information. And it's not just that it might need an executive summary. It's almost like, why am I reading this paper? Like, is this background? Is this because I have to make a decision based on this information? Like, what am I doing with this? Is this an update? Is this background? Is this for decision? And so I think if you are a CEO with a good team under you, and, it's almost a bit of training for them to change their thinking, to say, this is not just updates. This should be, why are we presenting this? So in your head, start thinking about, we're giving this to the board for what reason? For background, for noting, for decisions, like what are we asking of the board? So,
which means they're starting that drafting from that position as well. That's a really good point.
So it's really upskilling your executive.
Exactly. I got a report the other day from a team member who said, I think this would be really great for the board. And I looked at it. It's very interesting information. I'm looking at it going, I don't know what I'm asking them to do with that. So I'm having to go back to that person. I will go back to that person and sort of say, it's great information. Thank you for the data. Thank you for the story, the narrative that's threaded all the way through. But I can tell you now the board's going to ask this, and this, and wonder what they're meant to do with it. And I'm even unclear. So let's go back through that process and see what we can get out of it. Because if we're not clear, it's actually,
what are you sending it to the board for, right? Like, is it,
That's right. And then it becomes a waste of time for the board, because you're not talking about the subject. You're talking about what do you want me to do with this? Why am I reading this? And also then directors come in feeling really frustrated.
I guess the thing as well is, one of the things that you learn pretty quickly as a CEO is a board will come in and they're not in the business. And so, if it's a monthly or every 2 months meeting, they, have done their reading. So they might have spent, day, 2 days reading the papers. And obviously with the chair, for example, you will have had contact, but people kind of come to it. And when you're living and breathing the role as an exec, you just know things, right? So it's quite hard to transpose your mind into the board mind, which is you don't know everything. And yes, you're across it. But I think there's that jump of understanding of how the board comes to the information versus how an executive comes to the information when it's their day job. And I think that's a real skill for a CEO to pass on to their exec.
Absolutely. And I think it's helpful when, I think the senior leaders get to understand that much, much more acutely when they're in the board meetings and observing and being asked questions as well. They can see that, oh, hang on, your role is actually very different to mine. This is not like me reporting to my CEO and giving them a day-to-day update on something critical that's going on. It's, you've tapped in right now and then you'll tap out and you won't see all the minutiae that happens between now and the next meeting. But in saying that as well, the decision to bring your senior leadership team into the board, and it doesn't have to be a whole team, it can be specific roles.
I would say it shouldn't. I mean, I think there's you don't want too many people in the room, right? And it's the board meeting, right? Like it's not a meeting of everybody. But yeah, sometimes I think of this and it's that balance. You want the right people in the room. You don't want unnecessary people in the room.
That's right. For the right part of the board meeting agenda as well. So again, you don't necessarily want everyone in the room for the whole meeting because the board also needs the time to be the board, to do board things.
Yeah, and they may have an in-camera session before or after the meeting, but I think, generally the CEO will sit through all of the board meeting except for that beginning or end in-camera session. But I think I was just trying to think in terms of if you're the CEO, why would you not want the exec in there? And look, I think it is a workload managing thing. I think you might be discussing topics where you might not necessarily want the exec to hear the deliberations of the board because it may be that they're considering a future strategy that may or may not have implications. It may be that they're criticising a paper or a direction or results. And so I think sometimes you may need to just think, well, actually, could I filter this in a way that might be helpful, that they don't hear this directly or speculate about what's happening? So I think probably is subject matter dependent, but I don't think it's a blanket, yes, they're in. And I think the board may also have preferences about free discussions and not necessarily wanting the exec in every aspect of it. I think your point around in and out is good, but that's also logistics, right? Like calling people in, calling people out.
That's exactly right. The discipline in your board meeting agenda is actually really important to sort of make that happen because it's also got to be really also easy for your company sec or your minute taker, whoever's doing the minutes, to be able to record the in and out as well. But, other things to consider around, if you're going to have a senior leader come into a board meeting is, are they ready? Are they ready to be in front of directors and answer questions? Because the board, in listening to your senior exec, is not just really assessing them, they're also assessing the CEO. They're assessing the CEO's leadership of their senior team. They're assessing how the CEO is prepping their senior leaders for board discussions. They're assessing how the CEO is leading and creating cohesion within the senior leadership team as well. So you yourself as CEO must be confident or be moving to a state of confidence to have your senior leaders in front of the board.
Yeah. The board will look at it as a bit of an insight into the culture because the board needs to understand the culture of the organisation, and it's not always, because I've seen organisations where the CEO will kind of curate this appearance. Look, I've seen organisations where, there's an issue with culture and it's clearly the CEO is managing up and there is an issue with the culture in the organisation. And so, you know, there's much more of a curated appearance. Whereas I think if you're a CEO with a good team and or a board member, then you do want to use this as a bit of an insight into how people are interacting, how confidently people are speaking. You know, you can judge a lot just by body language, but I just don't think it's everything. And I think this also, to me, raises one issue of governance to be mindful of and think about as a CEO, which is if the board is asking questions and having a conversation with one or more members of the executive and then starts asking them to do things or do extra work, how you control that, because it's going to depend on what you've set up and what you want. But I think it would be hard in that instance for the CEO to say, well, no, we're not going to do that. You're going to have that kind of think ahead about if there happens to be conversations between board members and the exec for extra work, how you're going to respond and manage. And
well, that can go both ways, right? You could have, therefore, execs having direct access to directors, but you want to be kept informed. So I've had that as a senior leader where the board and management were working on a particular strategy and I had a concern and I could see some particular risks that I felt was important for the chair to know, because there was a very large decision coming up. But I spoke to the CEO. I had a conversation and presented it to the CEO. And we talked about the best way to approach that. And the outcome was that I would reach out to the chair directly.
Well, you did this as an exec.
I did it as an exec. But
you didn't have the CEO in that conversation when you did it?
I emailed the chair and CC'd the CEO. So I kept the CEO very included and part of it. And then the chair wanted to have a telephone conversation with me, which I did without the CEO. Not because we were excluding the CEO, that was just logistics. And it was actually really helpful. It was helpful for the board because there were some concerns that I had, some risks that I could see, and I wanted to talk that through with the chair. It was a big decision.
I'm kind of surprised the CEO didn't insist on being there, though.
I think it was logistics. It was moving super fast. It was moving within hours, days type of thing. It wasn't sort of something that was being planned. But it also meant that the chair went into the meeting. Actually, what happened was that the chair said, look, what we've discussed, can you summarise into a paper and send to me and I will have a look at it? And he then had a conversation with the board about it, and the CEO is very much included in that process. But I also recognised there was huge amounts of trust. There was huge amounts of trust between me and the CEO. There was huge amounts of trust between the CEO and the chair, and there was huge amounts of trust between me and the chair, and lots of respect between those parties for that to be able to happen. But again, the CEO knew every step of the way. I kept that individual informed. But it can happen that senior leaders might be the more appropriate person, but the senior leader needs to include the CEO and the chair, and the CEO should be talking with the chair about it as well. Because to your point, you don't want then directors just asking lots of requests from senior leaders of additional work, which starts to become much more challenging for a CEO and or a chair to sort of facilitate in terms of workload and priorities.
I mean, I think in this instance, the key thing is the trust. You had a really good relationship and, and that is on the CEO to build and maintain. And I think that's kind of the precondition for any of this to work, right? Like that you've actually got good relationships with your exec and good relationships with your board, because that's how it's actually going to work. All right. So, I mean, this is interesting, isn't it? Because I've seen board meetings where the execs sit there the whole time, obviously other than the in-camera part. And obviously both have got experience where the exec comes in and out. And so I guess ultimately it is the preference of the board and with the CEO's viewpoints and input, right, as to how it can work.
That's right. I think some easy ways to be able to sort of approach that is, firstly, particularly if you are a new for-purpose CEO, you've just come into a position and you're thinking about this is something you would like to occur. First, assess your exec's readiness. Don't assume in any way that they've been in front of a board before and they know the cultures and the behaviours of board meetings, actually assess the readiness for, are they ready for a board meeting in itself? Are they ready to be able to draft up papers and be able to speak to them and anticipate questions? If they're not, that's a lot of coaching and mentoring and training that can be delivered. That's technical skills that can be addressed. Do they have the confidence to be able to be informed and answer direct questions by directors? It is public speaking. They are going to be on the spot. How do you get them ready for that? And if you do believe that they're ready, then broach it with your chair, and your chair will have a preference as to how they want those meetings to run and whether they will have a view if there's value of having the senior leadership team in there for whatever parts of the meeting. And if there is a view that that would be helpful and constructive to the board, then be really disciplined and intentional about the structure of your board agenda so you can manage the logistics of different people coming in and out of the meeting.
Yeah. And I mean, in some ways, this is very easy if it's online, but a lot of people your exec might be just hanging around waiting to be texted, said, join the meeting now. So I think it can work. It can be really good. So I think have we missed anything?
I think that's a very good summary of you can do this. These are some of the reasons and benefits. These are some of the reasons why you may choose not to. But if you do, this is the approach.
Yeah, amazing.